the way I come to this topic of UAP, so I'm not, let's say, a sort of, as it were, as deeply embedded into the topic as I think a lot of the people who would come to a conference like this are. But nevertheless, I think the very idea of UAP and the very idea of having to confront potentially radically alien forms of intelligences is kind of where I am coming from on this, because I do think, as was mentioned in the introduction, that part of what's up for grabs in our time is what humanity means, right? I mean, and in a sense, if we actually do confront any kinds of extraterrestrial intelligences, right, this will be very much on the table about how we treat them. So this is the context in which I, generally speaking, come to the topic, namely that the way in which we deal with these kinds of extraterrestrial, radically alien forms of intelligence will say a lot about ourselves as human beings in a period where what it means to be human is very much up for grabs. Okay, so that's kind of, you might say, the conceptual starting point from my talk. Now, in the abstract that I've sent along, and perhaps you've read it and so forth, it seems to me that one way of framing this that, in a sense, we're already familiar with, though I don't see this very much invoked in the UAP literature, is this idea of thinking about the unthinkable. Okay. And this is something that, in fact, I bring up a lot when I'm dealing with students. And it is the title of a book by Herman Kahn, who was a very important Cold War analyst in the United States in the 1960s. So Herman Kahn is someone who wrote this book in 1965, and he was talking about the possibility of a nuclear war, right? And so in other words, he wasn't thinking about the nuclear war from the standpoint of something that might, that we might want to prevent, right? So he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about something that happens, and then what is the consequence of that? And so he's already thinking about that now. And so he's thinking about issues like, how bad could it be, right? And in his estimation, right, again, thinking about the 1960s in terms of the kind of nuclear arms that were available to both the United States and the USSR, who had these arms pointed at each other, right, that the possibility was that from a global standpoint, about a third of the human population might be eliminated. Okay, in the event of a nuclear war. It wouldn't last very long, but maybe a third of the population, especially if we take into account issues of fallout and all the rest of it, that this would be the consequence. And so then the issue becomes, how do you rebuild? What is it like the day after doomsday, right? And I teach a course. I teach a couple of courses that are kind of relevant to this. One of them is a course on the end times, the idea of end times, right? Where in some very radical sense, our sense of, as human beings, in end times, the way we have normally been living somehow comes to an end, okay? And then we have to in some way reconfigure, we have to reboot. In fact, I actually talk about this in the course in terms of a kind of rebooting of humanity in light of this catastrophic event, okay? And of course, what this gets the students to do is to think about, well, what is it that we still want to preserve, given that our material conditions have so radically changed as a result of whatever catastrophe we're talking about. And so it may not be nuclear war, it may be, artificial intelligence going out of control, it may be a climate catastrophe, right? There could be all these kinds of things. And of course, it could be extraterrestrials, okay? And my point in teaching this, and there's another course that I teach, which is on law, where in a sense I kind of focus this kind of question at one point in the module, sort of toward the end of the module, where I am I am actually raising issues that come from what I regard as a rather important book from Michael Bolander, who is a professor of law at the University of Durham in this country. And it's a book published by Brill in the Netherlands. And it's on extraterrestrial law. In other words, how do you, supposing you do encounter these beings, what are the terms of engagement that can be understood from the standpoint of law? And obviously, there's a sense in which international law can provide a kind of benchmark, you might say, for this. But of course, as Bolander himself recognizes, we would be talking about something that's interspecies in the broadest possible sense. Because normally when we talk about interspecies, we're talking about carbon-based biological beings like animals, plants, right? But when we're talking about extraterrestrials, these creatures, right, once we recognize that they exist and that they're intelligent and we have to engage with them, may not be carbon-based, right, but rather maybe silicon-based and who knows what, right? So it's interspecies in this kind of broad sense, but international law provides a certain kind of benchmark, you might say, for trying to understand that sort of engagement, okay? And I think it's a very profound book. I think it raises all kinds of issues that I think would be worth pursuing, and maybe it might be pursued in this conference, but in any case, I think that's quite an important thing. So let me return to Kahn for a moment. And so the idea here is with Kahn that, in a sense, if you already kind of believe that doomsday is going to happen, right? So, again, Kahn's book is not about preventing the nuclear war from happening. It's rather assuming it does happen, right? And then asking the question, what happens the day after doomsday? And I think that's a good frame of mind for thinking about our encounters with extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, the point about his book, of course, is that he was writing about this before any such war occurred. And of course, as you know, no such war occurred. Okay? Nevertheless, because people were thinking that such a war was inevitable, right? Already we start to get, in the 1960s, a whole stream of different sorts of technologies, right, that turn out to be very future-facing, but operate on the assumption that very key features about our current infrastructure, globally speaking, would be knocked out, okay? And this way of thinking, Herman Kahn, in a way, really articulated it, you might say, at a kind of theoretical standpoint. But of course, even when he was writing, this had already begun to exist with the establishment of DARPA, right? And this is, research agency of the United States Defense Department, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which began toward the end of the 1950s already, right? Largely in response to the launch of Sputnik, right? The Russian satellite, the Soviet satellite, and in 1957, I think it was, and when President Eisenhower got wind of this, he went to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and he asked them, "What the hell's going on with this? Right? What are we talking about here?" And they said, "Yeah, this is possible. In fact, it's even possible to launch people into space, but it's not interesting as a scientific project." Okay. So in other words, part of the reason why DARPA got invented was because the sort of mindset of the scientific establishment in the United States at the time was one where, all these technological advances of putting satellites and putting people up in space and all that is not very interesting from a physics standpoint. I mean, it can be done, and if you want to do it, you can do it. But it's not something that would naturally engage what the scientists themselves were doing. Now, this seemed to President Eisenhower, I think quite rightly, as really a kind of inability on the part of the scientific establishment to be able to think outside the box, as it were, right? In other words, the scientists were thinking that only the sort of stuff that they themselves had laid forward through their own research programs, which were largely, discipline-based, theoretically based, however you want to call it, right? That those were the things that really mattered, right? And that stuff, let's say, in the memory of the people who were talking about this, let's say the creation of the atomic bomb is merely an application of physics, right? Right. In other words, right, it's not surprising that if you got the best nuclear scientists, out there in Los Alamos, New Mexico, that if you gave them enough time and enough money, they'll come up with the atomic bomb. And that's not so surprising from a strictly disciplinary standpoint. Of course, the consequences of that, once it gets detonated, is enormous. But from a scientific standpoint, not such a big deal, right? Because we all knew that in principle, this kind of thing could be built. Now, you see, I think Eisenhower and the people behind the establishment of DARPA realize this is not quite the right way to think about the development of science, that in a sense, you just cannot let it go into, what I would call paradigm overdrive, right? Where basically the people who govern the science and who control the quality control of science and all the rest of it, that those people should just be allowed to go wherever they go, even if it's into an infinity of irrelevance, right? That there's a sense in which certain kinds of technological applications of science may in fact be game changers that will force us radically to reconceptualize, right, a lot of the infrastructure on which science up to this point has been based. Okay, and this is the kind of thing we're talking about here, because if we're talking about the day after doomsday, we're talking about how do we rebuild the world, and we might not have all the pieces that we had before, but nevertheless, we're going to try to somehow, recover. And it's in this context that the internet, of course, was created. And it was a way for scientists in the first instance to be able to communicate with each other without having to rely on telecommunications that were already available, because those would be the first things to be taken down if there was a nuclear war. Right? So in other words, global telecommunications would immediately be taken down. So you need some kind of alternative channel for at least the people who, the elite people to be able to communicate with each other. And the internet got created that way. So in other words, it was created not because it was needed at the time, but rather because in light of what you're imagining could be a kind of future disaster where you have to rebuild without being able to presuppose that, right? So the idea of building back without being able to presuppose the infrastructure you've got is a very crucial part of this component. And I think this is a good way, actually, for us to think about our potential encounters with extraterrestrials. Okay, in other words, the time to start thinking about this is now, right? And the research that would be relevant for, as it were, being able to, however you want to put it, maximize our control over the situation, maybe, right, would be to start thinking about it now, even if the evidence that there are extraterrestrials is ambiguous, right? So in other words, the ambiguous nature of the evidence should not be deterring us from, in fact, thinking in these rather radical terms. Because once the extraterrestrials come to us, it will be a little bit too late. Okay, and I think this is the spirit in which you should take the kind of what you should say, a morality tale or whatever it is that I'm telling you here, right? I've talked about this general way of thinking, right, whereby one should always, as it were, anticipate the worst consequence and then think about how would you be able to build back better from that worst consequence. I've talked about this as precipitatory governance, right? And so, in other words, expect the worst, right? This is different from from a phrase that's actually very much used in the circles I travel in science and technology studies, called anticipatory governance. Okay? And so anticipatory governance is about, let's say you're developing an innovation already, right? You're developing a new drug, you're developing a new product, right? You can think of this from a purely marketing perspective. The thing isn't on stream yet, but nevertheless, what you want to do is to test drive it, right? You want to say, okay, supposing we introduce this thing, what are people going to think about it? Are they going to believe it or not believe it? And you use that moment before the product is actually out there, right, to be able to steer, as it were, the final version of the product that actually faces the market. Okay. And anticipatory governance very often involves focus groups, very often involves, right. So in other words, the potential consumers, right? So in other words, it's meant to kind of create a kind of friendly environment for the reception of something that you're trying to do. Now, precipitatory governance is operates from the opposite position, namely, look, something bad's going to happen. You're not going to be able to avoid it. And let's say that bad thing is we're going to be dealing with extraterrestrials. Well, in that case, then, how should we be preparing ourselves now, given that we actually want to have a kind of fighting chance, or at least, deal with the situation in a reasonable fashion? It doesn't make sense simply to ignore the situation until the probabilities get to the right level, right? That it's likely that there's an extraterrestrial next door, right? But because that will probably be too late. You have to start planning now, and you have to start planning for the possibility that these beings are already in our midst even, right? And so then the question becomes, how do you deal effectively with them? And so this is what precipitatory governance is about, and it's very much modeled, I would say, on this kind of Cold War mentality that Herman Kahn exemplified, whereby you're imagining the worst case scenario, but then you're saying the worst case scenario is not annihilation, right? It's something else, right? And then the question becomes, how do we recover, and how, in a sense, can we, already begin to be in a position that if the worst case scenario happens, we can bounce back effectively, right? So this is the frame of mind that I think we should be thinking about, this possibility of encounters with extraterrestrial intelligence. So in other words, if you want to know where I stand on the epistemological side of this, I am completely agnostic about whether these creatures are already here or whether all these blips on the screen and everybody gets very excited about that from the Pentagon, whether these things are actually really extraterrestrials or whatever, right? I'm kind of agnostic on this. I mean, I'm willing to let the evidence go where it goes, but my view is, generally speaking, and certainly the posture of humanity, is that we are priming ourselves already to receive these beings, right? And here is where, something like SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is kind of the biggest witness to this, right? Why the hell are we actually trying to send all of these radio signals and whatever, right? All these things that are designed, to seek out possible intelligences in other parts of the universe. Why are we even doing this in the first place, right? Well, because we're looking for them. So, if these extraterrestrials come to our door, right, there's a sense in which, we invited them already, at least at a conceptual standpoint. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be bothering with this kind of thing. So there is a sense in which I think the kind of position that I'm advocating here is one that, in a sense, would keep us responsible, at least, with regard to our attitude, our rather open attitude toward the possibility of life and intelligence in the rest of the universe, right? So whatever you make of what I'm saying here, I do think that it might, you might say, in some cosmic way, enhance our moral responsibility for things that we are already doing, okay? we're looking for these creatures. We really are, right? And so let's not forget that point. I think sometimes this phrase UAP, it's a bit mealy-mouthed, right? Because UAP is a little too agnostic, right? It makes it sound like, well, we don't know what these things are. Who knows what they are? Well, why are we even worried about this, right? We're worried about this because, in a sense, we already figure out that there are these other creatures or these other intelligences out there, and these UAPs may provide evidence for that, right? I mean, that's the kind of default position in which makes people so excited about this stuff. So I do think there's a sense in which, insofar as there is a distinction between the study of UAPs and the study of SETI, right, I think that should be eliminated, right? I mean, I think they're just two sides of the same coin, to be perfectly honest. And I think the UAP stuff is, you might say, for the people who are a bit coy about the matter. So just to get that out of the way, right? Now, I happen to think that that if we're talking about the possibility that we might be encountering extraterrestrial intelligences either now or in the future, I think this is a good time in a way to do it, precisely because, as I said in the beginning of the talk, right, that the notion of humanity is very much up for grabs, right? And I think one of the points that Michael Bolander makes in this book, right, is that, whatever else we're going to do if we ever encounter these extraterrestrial creatures, is that we're going to have to establish some kind of moral baseline for dealing with them. And Bolander has a particular way of looking at this, right? Bolander is of the, and he's very much influenced, I think, by the history of international law as it exists on Earth, right? And it's summarized by this phrase that he uses in the beginning of the book, right? If you want peace, prepare for war, right? You may know this is an old Latin thing, right? If you want peace, prepare for war, right? And so he operates under what he regards as a kind of defensive posture with regard to these extraterrestrials. I'm not sure, actually, that ought to be the default position, precisely because we have been operating for quite a long time with a sort of very open-ended conception of what it means to be human. And my view, and here I am very much on the side of Immanuel Kant, right, who took very seriously the idea of cosmopolitan citizenship. And I would just say, look, the possibility of extraterrestrials makes this more literal, right, as a possibility, right? Cosmopolitanism is no longer just the different peoples of the earth being able to have some kind of common moral universe, but rather it could be all the creatures of the cosmos, okay? And so I sort of start, you might say, from that position, and that, I think part of the Kantian position on this, certainly one that I have invoked, because I'm someone, in terms of my interest in the future of humanity, is very much interested in how our conception of the human might move into areas that, we might call machine rights, right? So in other words, artificial intelligences might, as it were, be sort of naturalized, to use that word surrounding citizenship, naturalized into humanity, as well as animals, right? That animal rights might involve a certain kind of naturalization into the human. And in fact, I talk about in my writings on Humanity 2.0, which is something that some of you who know about my work on transhumanism might be familiar with, right? I talk about a republic of humanity, which is this kind of extended human citizenship, right? Which potentially can include at least some machines and some animals, according to criteria that, we can discuss in a very interesting kind of way about who's in and who's out, right? And in fact, this is the kind of issue that when I'm teaching my law course, I focus very much on in the second half of the course, right? So So in other words, if we're going to have an expanded notion of humanity, what would be the criteria to naturalize beings who are not born Homo sapiens, right? And so in this context, I talk about the idea of cis-humanity, right? To recall, as you know, from the discourse surrounding transgender and so forth, there is this somewhat pejorative use of the word cis, right, to mean a person who's a member of a certain kind of gender by virtue of birth, but only by virtue of birth, right? And the part of the transgender agenda is about kind of minimizing the significance of that cis thing, right? That the fact that just because you're born a woman or born a man, that doesn't mean you need to remain in that situation certainly from the standpoint of legal or moral recognition. And I think something could be said about humanity where the cis-human is the Homo sapiens, okay? And the question then becomes, okay, well, can you extend or retract the notion of human from Homo sapiens? And that's, I think, a real legal issue that's very much with us. I think then this, as it were, potentially brings any kind of extraterrestrials, that is to say, beings whose origin has nothing to do with Darwin's conception of evolution, right? Beings from a totally different lineage, you might say. It doesn't rule them out from our conception of humanity. Now, I say this not to be very science fictional or fanciful or any of that stuff, but rather because the idea that the human is coextensive with Homo sapiens is only something that comes from the mid-18th century. Okay, Michel Foucault made a big deal about this in his book, The Order of Things, right? I mean, and so in other words, if you look at the word human prior to the mid-18th century, it's kind of a free-floating predicate, right? It has to do with a being that displays certain characteristics, certain qualities. You might call them moral qualities. You might call them virtues, whatever, right? A certain form of intelligence, right? But the point is that this being need not be Homo sapiens, or at least Homo sapiens wasn't seen as some kind of default position for the human. And so if you look at, you have a long history, you think about Aesop's fables, you think about all kinds of other things, right, where humanity is in fact attributed to animals, right, where you and the whole idea that we should have a humane treatment of animals has a lot to do with the sort of ambiguity of the predicate human, okay, that it doesn't attach exclusively to Homo sapiens. Now, as I said, in the mid-18th century, this starts to solidify more. Now, think about that moment. So this moment, by the way, in case I imagine most of you know this, right? Linnaeus, right? Linnaeus, the Swedish taxonomist, who is primarily, who's responsible for the way this binomial nomenclature, right? The two names that we give to species, not only of animals and plants, but also of rocks as well, right? Where you have a kind of a genus name and then you have a more specific name, comes from him. And it's in that context that the term Homo sapiens gets coined, okay? Now, the interesting thing about this, right, is if you pull back, let's say, 150 years maybe, maybe even 200 years, right? So we go from the mid-18th century, right, to the mid-16th century, and you start to look at people who are doubting and maybe even having abandoned the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. This is the thing that we associate, right, certainly starting in the 17th century with Copernicus, right, that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Aristotle is wrong, right, that there is this much larger universe out there with all kinds of creatures and stuff like that. Once that kind of idea starts to take hold, it begins to take hold in the Italian Renaissance. And of course, some of you will know about Giordano Bruno, who got burned at the stake for believing things like this, right? He believed that there were all of these multiple worlds out there, and they all had creatures, and these creatures were themselves intelligent creatures. And he was not wedded to a Homo sapiens version of human. Right? So we think about Bruno when we do the history of early modern Europe. We class Bruno as one of the humanists. And that's fine. He definitely was a humanist. But what he considered under the category of human was not restricted to Homo sapiens. This is the point, right? And so this is a guy who's imagining, right, that there are all these other planets with all these other beings out there, and these are beings who at least are eligible to be considered human by us. And that in some sense, our conception of our place in the world and our morality and all of these kinds of things, right, should be influenced by this fact, right? That there is a plurality of worlds, right? And this idea actually continues to animate the early modern thinkers, right, who are the people who, in fact, ground the kind of scientific worldview that we still adhere to today, right? And of course, the most important one, I would say, in the later period would be Leibniz. Okay, and Leibniz even discusses in great detail about how we might negotiate with these characters if we found them in extraterrestrial realms, right? Now, what was going on there, right? Because this is not crazy. What was going on there was that if you, as it were, abandon the idea that the Earth as a planet is privileged, which is this kind of term that, what should we say? Thomists and these kind of Christians who are very still wedded to Aristotle think, right? That there's something privileged about planet Earth. To say there's, so you sort of move away from that idea, and then you start reading the Bible. You're not told in the Bible that there is only one Earth, okay? And so what one can imagine, and I think this is kind of the idea that all of these people starting in the Italian Renaissance and moving, into the early modern period and Leibniz and so forth are imagining, that there's a sense in which this Bible story applies to all of the intelligences wherever they may be, right? In all the Earths, all over the galaxy, right? And so there's a sense in which once you suspend this belief in the special nature of the Earth as a planet, then your idea of humanity can be expanded. And of course, one of the consequences of that, of course, and you could see this from the paintings of extraterrestrials and things like that, is that, as a matter of fact, when you have artists imagining what all of these beings who are, we might call human, look like in other planets, right? They don't look like Homo sapiens necessarily. And that's a very important point. However, this issue really does start to disappear pretty quickly once you start to get, in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, this very clear identification of the human with Homo sapiens. Because then the idea of human gets very, you might say, materialistically grounded, much more so than it had been up to that point. Okay? And so when we talk, for example, about an anthropic principle, right, which is supposed to talk about the fact that human beings, in a sense, the fact that we're able to do physics, right, the fact that we're able to understand the universe in the round, in the terms that mathematics and physics allows us to, in some sense says something special about us, right? Usually in the formulation of the anthropic principle, that us, those beings who are capable of doing this, are carbon-based beings, kind of like us, right? I mean, so in other words, if you look at the way in which the anthropic principle is specified, it's kind of specified toward a Homo sapiens. But of course, if you have this more expansive notion of humanity, then it's not at all clear that the anthropic principle in that kind of limited sense is really the one you ought to be operating from, right? And that's something more like kind of the kind of SETI mentality, right? Where we're talking about beings who can understand, computer code or binary logic or something like that. That might seem to actually be the more appropriate standard for thinking about the possibility that there's intelligence in the universe, and on the basis of which there might be some kind of common understanding, right? So in a sense, I think with our, this kind of SETI mentality, I think we're actually returning to this kind of broader, more expansive sense of humanity that we had actually before the human was so closely identified with Homo sapiens, okay? So now what's the implication of all this from the standpoint of what we should be doing now? Okay, I think the first thing to say is I think this could be this prospect, right, that there are intelligent life forms that we could be communicating with, but which nevertheless, from a material constitutional standpoint, are radically different from us. In particular, they may not even be carbon-based in any kind of significant way, I think ought to be a kind of reasonable ground for at least jump-starting physics in a new direction, okay? Now, some of you may know, if you follow the podcast universe, there is this guy, Eric Weinstein, right, who is trained in mathematics and economics, right, and physics, and he's claiming to have come up with some kind of geometrically unified account of the universe or whatever, and I'm not here to argue the case for that one way or another. But one of the things that that's part of the background of his thinking is that he believes that physics, as is currently pursued by the scientific establishment, has been stagnating basically for the last 50 years. This is a very common sort of complaint, and that there's a sense in which we need a new, as it were, a new steer. Right. So in other words, and I do agree with him on this, namely that in a sense, you cannot trust the physics establishment to necessarily have its finger on where the action is with regard to having a greater understanding of the physical universe. That in a sense, we might need to start from another place and then bring that physics in and expand that physics. OK, and here the idea, and this is an idea Weinstein himself floats, is that all of these UAP things and all these people who are claiming we have extraterrestrial encounters, right, that in some sense they are operating at dimensions of physical reality that are not, as it were, immediately available, or part necessarily of the normal way in which we comprehend the physical universe, even granting a normal understanding of Einstein and quantum mechanics and all the rest of it. There might be, as it were, a sort of higher level of dimensionality in which these beings are operating, which in a way, if we understood that, would radically shape the way we think about matter and energy and stuff like that. And it would also explain how it was possible for them to get here, okay? And I think there's something to that, right? I mean, not that there's any theory I have that I can pull out of my back pocket, but I think if you were to operate on the assumption that this is correct, right? In other words, operate under the assumption that there are beings that are actually traveling and transmitting, right, through dimensions that we do not normally understand, it might actually encourage a sort of sense of maybe we need to think of the physical universe as having a different kind of geometry, a different kind, of way of specifying and calculating, right? In other words, a lot of the mathematical aspects of the way we think about physical reality, maybe we ought to make greater utilization of the mathematical tools that are available to us, right? Which at this point are seen as merely speculative, like imagining multidimensional space. Maybe actually that sort of speculative speculative part of mathematics may in fact be quite relevant to understanding this extraterrestrial stuff. And it wouldn't be unreasonable from the standpoint of the history of science, right? Because the history of science, right, if you think about the rise of differential geometries, right, and non-Euclidean geometry in particular, and how that got unfolded in the 19th century, and how it was initially seen to be this very speculative, thing, right? And that mathematicians, if they're real mathematicians, ought to be focusing on providing tools that physicists can work on, right? This was a very common sort of line of argument into the late 19th century, actually, until Einstein pulls out Riemannian geometry, right, to kind of revolutionize physics with relativity theory by explaining all the anomalies, right, that were associated with the speed of light and all that jazz, right, which you're all familiar with from the Michelson-Morley experiment and trying to make sense of the Lorentz transformation and all that, right? That really, the way the job was done in the end was by bringing a speculative branch of mathematics into a real physics situation, which in a sense people thought, didn't necessarily think was relevant at the time. And I think this kind of mentality, right, of imagining that the physical universe actually has a kind of broader dimensionality than we normally take for granted, is really crucial, as it were, for us to be properly receptive to the extraterrestrial life forms, okay? So Weinstein, regardless of what you think about his own kind of theory about this, I think is onto something as a general kind of framework in which to normalize this discussion of extraterrestrials and stuff like this, okay? Now, I know I don't have that much time left, but I want to raise one thing, because I think Michael Bolander's book, which if you haven't read it, on extraterrestrial law, from Brill publisher, I recommend you look at it in detail, because one of the things that he talks about in that book, and so he's imagining a kind of various types of encounters, and I don't want to talk about the aggressive ones, the negative ones, because everybody always focuses on that there's going to be a war of the worlds and so forth. And I'm not so sure that actually will be happening. Certainly not in any kind of explicit sense, in the kind of H.G. Wells style of thinking about these matters, largely because I think most of the action is going to be trying to actually establish some kind of point of contact where if both sides are intelligent, however the nature of their intelligences, but if both sides are intelligent, right, I think the issue is going to be trying to find a common means of communication, and that both sides will at least be sufficiently patient, as it were, to try to do that, okay? So I'm starting from that kind of premise, namely that there will be misunderstanding, there'll be miscommunication, there may be casualties, right? But there wouldn't be a matter of, one world trying to annihilate or conquer another world in some kind of straightforward sense that we would recognize. So I don't believe that will happen. And I think in this respect, I'm a little more optimistic than Bolander is. However, Bolander does raise this issue about, okay, we establish contact, right? There's some sense in which they're talking to each other and we understand what they're saying and vice versa. Then one of the prospects that they might put on the table, and I'm going to end on this point, is this idea of a galactic club, okay? And this is like if you remember Star Trek, right, that there is this kind of federation, right, which Star Trek and the Earthlings are part of, a sort of general kind of cosmic federation of allied planets. It's a bit like United Nations of the cosmos kind of thing. And this is, I take it to be the model for what he's talking about under the Galactic Club. And the idea, of course, is there are going to be entry requirements, right? There are going to be entry requirements. Now, of course, we, the great humans, the people with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, blah, 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 right? We're going to think, well, we're we're definitely fit to go into the Galactic Club because we're humans, right? We're the human people, right? We're the ones we know, we're the ones with the values. You guys, we're trying to figure you out whether you have values, right? No, not so easy, chump. Not so easy. And so this issue about what exactly would be the normative ground for a kind of discussion, right? And that might involve, right, our planet moving into this galactic club, right? Where the galactic club is understood as a kind of normative framework that in a sense could treat the relationship between citizens of different planets and so forth, something like international law, right? And so, there are a lot of things that needs to be thought about. And so this is the kind of thing I raise to my law students. Because, of course, we could start with the issue that the universal of human rights isn't even adhered to or even subscribed to by all the Homo sapiens, right? We could start with that one. But let's say we put that to one side. Let's say that our galactic friends don't quite realize just how hypocritical we are with regard to human rights. Let's say we can put that to one side, and let's say what they've got at their disposal and what they believe in our word is the idea that we stand behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, what could they possibly find wrong with this thing? They might believe, for example, that they believe that individuation is a problem. Right. So in other words, one of the things that's very fundamental to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and very much fundamental to when we think about human rights is that while human rights are something that you might say belongs to the species, it belongs to the species through each individual. Right? So in other words, each individual has human rights. It's not that human rights is just a collective thing where the individuals are just part of a whole, but rather each individual human being, right, has human rights. And this is very clear from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in fact, the justification for collective social projects like religion and culture and science and all these things, art, right? All these things that are mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are defended on the grounds that it involves a kind of mutually enriching interaction of individuals that ends up then providing a kind of rich, productive base for the future of humanity, where the future of humanity is understood in terms of the reproduction of these individual human beings, right? So this is the image of what the human condition is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But supposing that throughout most of the galaxy, among the intelligent beings, this kind of individuation is actually something that's been sort of superseded or seen as just a cause of unnecessary divisiveness, right? So in other words, imagine that the Galactic Club are communists, right? Imagine that they are communists at the highest scale, right? And that they believe the individuals are replaceable parts of a whole, and the whole is the galaxy, and the idea of having all of these additional sorts of beings as part of it, right, is to sustain the larger whole, and that one's identity is to be established in relation to this whole in the primary sense, okay? And that ought to be where the normative frame is set. Now, I think human beings would have a hard time with this, okay? No matter how friendly we are with these galactic beings who are inviting us to join their club, I think we would have a hard time agreeing to this. However, is this an offer we can't refuse, right? Because if these galactic club guys already have a whole lot of other intelligent planets lined up for this, then who are we to disagree? Do we just sort of self-exile? Will we be allowed to do this? Right? It seems to me that this is kind of more the issue here, especially because within human culture, there is a kind of, ambivalence, open-mindedness about just how important the individual human being is with regard to the preservation of humanity, okay? And I think something like a galactic club were we to face these kinds of extraterrestrial intelligences that confront us with this radically different sort of normative frame, which is comprehensible to us, but one that in a way on the surface seems extremely radical, whether we would agree to this and what would be the consequences if we did not agree to this. Okay, I will stop the talk here because I think this is, in a sense, this is where my thinking leads. And I think, this is a relatively productive way to think positively about the fact that we are eventually going to be able to encounter UAPs, extraterrestrial intelligences, whatever you want to call them. And I'll stop here.